So we are back for another conversation. This is the second month in my year-long project on improving my foundation. So for anyone interested, the first month was fitness, and in the last month I started a new daily exercise routine. And this month is productivity, where the focus is on setting up a full capture productivity system. So keeping track of all the tasks, calendar appointments, all the many things in a busy life. And so that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm joined, of course, by my lovely wife, Zaritza, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what's been going on in the last month and how the project's going.
Let's start with an update on fitness, though.
Yeah.
And then we'll kind of talk about productivity a little bit. So how is fitness going? Are you still doing it every day? Any challenges, any successes? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, very briefly, I mean, I've been continuing the daily habit. I've been still waking up in the morning and exercising, and so far I haven't missed a day yet, which I say not to like brag, but that's just been a lucky, fortunate thing. I think often things in life, you get sick, you have things that make it impossible for you to work out for a period of time. So just fortunately for the last 2 months, I haven't had those issues. I feel like I'm really in the groove now with working out. It just feels very natural. So the first month it had that kind of novelty effect, and now it's just a background thing, especially shifting the topic of the month. Now I've been reading all these books about productivity and, management and business and work. And so fitness has kind of receded into the background. So it's very nice that the habit's been continuing. And in terms of just my, fitness goals, I feel like I've lost a little bit of weight, and I've been improving in my cardiovascular and strength fitness. Although for my strength fitness, I feel like I'm trying to get back to where I was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, pre-kids, PK. And so I'm still working on that, and we'll see how the year goes and how that keeps getting updated.
That's amazing. I, on the other hand, have not had the same experience.
No?
No, not really.
No.
I don't know if you want me to give
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can talk about what you're working on too. Yeah.
I'm also trying to exercise every day. But when we were away visiting our family in Winnipeg, I decided to, instead of doing my regular exercises, and I usually do yoga and Pilates and a little bit of spin class here or there, I decided that I'm going to go running with you.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and then I did that 2 days in a row, and I hurt my back.
Yeah.
And and then multiple...
It's all better now. So.
It's all better. But multiple chiro sessions later and massage therapy, I'm feeling a lot better, and I'm back to my routine. But do you have any advice about injury? Because I feel like this is something that obviously you haven't experienced yet. You've been really good about taking it slow and kind of doing, I guess, listening to your body and being consistent. But injury does happen, and sometimes it can be a setback. So for those people like me, do you have any advice on that?
Well, I mean, sometimes these things just happen. I don't think you were doing anything particularly strenuous. It was sort of a little unusual that you would, hurt your back running. So, I mean, I don't really have much to say. It wasn't like you were sprinting or doing anything really out of the ordinary, although sometimes you do have some back issues. So I think if you do experience that, then you just have to take a break. That's just how life works. In terms of how do you avoid that, I mean, I think one of the big things is you don't want to ramp up the intensity too quickly. So I've always had this idea that it should be consistency, not intensity, especially in the beginning, because I think it's very easy to overdo it when you're starting a new routine. And so definitely in the first month and stuff, I was running a lot less than I could have, and I was lifting a lot less than I could have, just because I knew, well, not only do I not want to injure myself and miss a bunch of days, but I also didn't want it to be the case that I'm super sore the next day and getting it so intense that I can't sustain the daily habit. And so now I'm pushing myself a bit more, but that's after 2 months of doing it regularly. But I mean, I think, just as I said, I'm fortunate I didn't get injured. I could have easily just tripped on a rock and sprained my ankle and then been either out of commission for doing that, or I would have had to do some different workout for a week or two. So I think being flexible in general with these things is important. I think that if you have this overly rigid mindset of oh, well, this happened to me, now I failed, well, then that's going to set you up in a bad way for the long term, because there's always going to be things that are happening. So I think the important thing is that you're continuing to do it. And we've even been just having these discussions about how do we fit it in, because now I've taken the really early morning slot, and so we've been trying to decide whether you want to go after me or in the evening. And you know, I think as the year goes on, we'll keep updating not only on what I'm doing, but maybe what you're doing in this regard as well.
Well, I'm figuring out what works best for my body, because, and that was another thing too, I'm listening to myself talk to my chiro, and I'm saying to him, because he's asking me, what do you do for exercise? And I was like, well, I've signed up for this new gym, and I'm trying to go to all these different classes, and this day I'm doing spin class, and this day I'm doing Pilates, and I'm doing yoga, and I'm doing this and that. And he's just kind of looking at me, he's like, that's a little, maybe that you're doing a little bit too much of everything. Maybe you need to focus on something that you like doing and is good for you. And so he's like, what sports did you used to do? And I said, well, I'm a swimmer. I used to swim. So he's like, well, maybe you should start swimming more. And so for my cardio, because I was doing, I do a strength class where it's mostly really weights. And then I was doing some yoga and some Pilates. And then the only thing I was really missing is cardio. And like I said, it seems like, I don't know why, but when I'm doing spin and running, I'm straining my back. And maybe because these are things that I haven't done for a long time, I'm pushing myself too hard.
Yeah.
So it's putting a lot of strain on my back. I can't move. And I think it's also because we have a toddler that I'm constantly lifting her up, carrying her around. That's already putting a strain on my back. And so I need to do something that I'm comfortable with. So I'm trying to do swimming twice a week. And so that's something that we're kind of struggling fitting in, but we'll kind of figure it out, I think.
Well, yeah. And I think part of it too, and I had the same experience before, is that the sort of struggling to fit things in part. I mean, part of it is that if you don't do something very consistently, it's not part of the background. And so there's sort of a deliberate decision being made every day of like, am I going to do this? And so shifting to just like, there's no decision, I just do it every day. It's one of those things that sounds like it's harder, but it actually makes it easier. Not only is it a habit for me, but it's also a habit for you, because you know that I'm doing this in the morning. And so I think we will get there. And I think for anyone who's listening and they're kind of maybe also in the same position, they're just like, well, it's like I've missed some days, or I've been having some more difficulty with it. You just have to keep going. You have to find a routine that works for you. But I'm sure we'll talk about it again more next month, and we'll see how it's been updating for both of us. Yeah,
but I am very grateful for it. I'm grateful for this project because I feel like it's keeping me accountable. I don't think anyone needs to keep you accountable. You're pretty good at doing that yourself. But I feel like I've done so good with my exercise, and I'm really happy. Besides the little setback of like kind of straining my back, I feel really happy about what I'm doing, and I feel happier and healthier and more energetic on most days. And yeah, I've been really liking it. But I think that's a good update. For that, so we can move on to productivity and talk about that a little bit.
Productivity. Yeah, I mean, this was a topic that's like very near and dear to my heart. I mean, I've written a lot about productivity. I mean, fitness, I mean, obviously I've exercised for a while and I know a little bit about it, but it's never been really a focus of my writing or my public work. And productivity, on the other hand, definitely has been. I mean, I've produced 2 courses with Cal Newport, the author of Deep Work. I've written a lot of books about productivity directly or indirectly myself. And so revisiting this was an interesting kind of experience, because you're in some cases rereading books and ideas that you read decades ago and sort of like, how do I think about it now, being a father of 2 with a business versus like when I first read, let's say 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or Getting Things Done when I was like, in my late teens or something. It was just a totally different perspective. So it's been interesting kind of revisiting this topic this month.
Yeah. One thing, I'm not sure how you're going to feel about this question, because I know you got asked something like this in an interview before, and you thought it was funny. But what I wanted to ask you is, what is productivity? But more so, like, what is productivity to you? Yeah. Because I think when people talk or think about productivity, they think about different things. Yeah. Like like accomplishing something, right? So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting because there's sort of two different definitions that kind of flow around. So the first one is sort of the popular understanding of productivity. Like when you overhear someone say, "Oh, I was really productive today."
Yeah.
What they usually mean is I worked really hard today.
Yes.
And that's the sort of common way of thinking about productivity, that is sort of like how industrious you are, how hardworking are you, how much are you devoting your time and energy towards like useful valuable activities versus, relaxing or socializing or even things that like, a lot of people would be like, oh, I cleaned the house today. I wasn't very productive because it's not like paid work, right? So sometimes people have this kind of really, sort of narrow definition of productivity. But I kind of think of it in a broader sense that productivity is just sort of your capacity for doing things that you intend to do. And another way of looking at it is sort of the economist definition, which is the amount of output you get for a unit of input. So in this sense, like the economist definition, it's kind of the opposite of the way we think of productivity. It's not about working hard. It's sort of like, how do you get the most done for working the least hard so that you're working the least amount of hours, the least amount of inputs. And so I think this tension between the kind of productivity is about like working really hard and the idea of like working really efficiently or getting a lot done and not working really hard kind of sets up this interplay when you're talking about it, because for a lot of people the month of I'm going to be productive is like, how do I work as hard as possible this month, which is really not the goal for me. And it wasn't the goal when I was sort of thinking about this for the course.
One thing I wanted to ask too is, what do you think are sort of your strengths and your weaknesses when it comes to productivity?
Yeah. I mean, everyone I think has their own personality and how their personality interacts with the work they're doing. And so for me, I feel like, and I think people who maybe have followed me for a while or can see my public projects will know that like I'm pretty good at like sticking at hard self-set kind of ambitious projects. I mean, this would be one of them, but also like my MIT challenge, finishing writing books. So I'm very self-motivated in this way. So it's never been hard for me to be like, okay, I'm working on this thing for a year and it's going to be like 2,000 hours and then I get it done. On the other hand, I tend to be like bad with like peripheral tasks. So, the example I think that I wrote in the opening update on the newsletter about this project was that like I've had in my to-do list, like getting a new family doctor for like months, and I have not done it. Now, some of that is just a prioritization issue. Like it hasn't been a priority. Every week when I look at my tasks, it's kind of like down there of like, well, I don't actually need to do this week. But sometimes it can also just be because I don't really want to do that. I'm interested in the project. That's what I'm thinking about all the time. Whereas this feels like a distraction. And I definitely felt like a lot of household stuff was of that nature. I'm working hard all day and then it's sort of like, okay, you've got to like stain the fence or you've got to like fix some light bulb somewhere. And there's been a light bulb that's been burnt out for like 2 weeks. And I'm always like, oh yeah, but I got to get the ladder to do it. And so it's been waiting there for a while. She's laughing right now because she knows that that's true.
I wrote this quote here.
Yeah.
I read this in your article. You said, I spent the first 2 weeks of the month changing light bulbs and fixing door hinges that had been neglected.
Yeah.
So I know we have a lot of light bulbs.
Well, I wasn't spending all the entire 2 weeks fixing light bulbs. Like, I mean...
So, I don't know who designed their house.
Yeah,
but
there's a lot of pot lights and they're very
There's
high up.
so many pot lights in our house.
Yeah.
So, yes, it does take a little bit of time to change the light bulbs.
But I mean, this is a good example. I mean, I don't know. Like, yeah, but it's just the kind of thing where these are these sort of peripheral tasks that they aren't actually like, I don't have time to do them.
Yeah.
They were just something that was sort of falling through the cracks. And I think a big reason was related to this idea of a full capture productivity system, because I'd been pretty good about keeping my work tasks organized. Okay, I have like a calendar set up for, I go on a lot of podcasts. And so, I could make sure those were scheduled properly and, these kinds of appointments and things. Whereas stuff at the home, we were often a lot more informal about. And I think part of the informality too was that it is a joint project, right? And so like some of the stuff I kind of implicitly, I'm the person who takes out the recycling and the garbage. That's true. You tend to do more of the laundry. And like, these are some of the things that we just kind of automatically take our domains. But in other cases, there's just stuff that would come up that like, we kind of talk about doing it in general and it's not clear who's doing it. And, and then sometimes there's a long delay because, we're just not organized about it.
our calendar wasn't synced.
Yeah, that too.
Until this month. And I feel like us doing that has made such a big difference.
Yeah.
Because now we're always
aware of what the other person's doing. Yeah.
So I actually wanted to talk about this full capture system. This is David Allen's
book, Getting Things Done. I mean, This is the major inspiration. I mean, I came online writing in 2006, which was like right at the sweet spot for when like David Allen was, there was a lot of blogs that were just about getting things done. I mean, the blog 43 Folders, that was a direct inspiration. And so he's sort of like the main influence on me in terms of thinking about productivity.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk about these steps of like the inbox, the projects, the next actions, the someday lists, because we kind of put that together
for our household stuff.
Yeah. So maybe we can touch on that.
Yeah. So the basic idea of a full capture system is that you want to get all of the tasks, ideas, appointments, like random thoughts, like maybe we'd like to do this one day, and put it in a system so that it's not in your head. So basically the rule is like, if you have to think to yourself, oh, I need to remind myself about this, then that's a problem, because we're really bad at reminding ourselves about this. And then also it takes up a lot of mental bandwidth where you're constantly thinking about, okay, all right, when I get here, I'm going to have to do this. And so you want to create a trusted system that will capture and store all of these things so you don't have to think about it. And David Allen's system is not the only one. And in some cases, I mean, when I first read the book when I was like, 17 or something, it seemed way too complicated. Like my life was a lot simpler then, and I just didn't need all of the systems he was setting up. But I think in his sort of explanation of the full system, it's really easy to trim stuff off of like, okay, I don't need that, or this is a little bit overkill. But the full description is always good because sometimes you do have to do those things. So the basic idea is that you want to organize, and I would say like 3 broad folders. You have an inbox, which is just sort of like uncategorized, anything that comes into your life, ideas, tasks, things that you're, unless you know immediately, like, okay, I'm going to put this on the grocery list right now because I know I have to buy it for groceries. You just put it in the inbox. And then you have next actions list, which are things that you plan on doing as soon as you have time. There's projects lists, which are for things that are going to take more than one step. So if it's like, you're looking into going to a particular school, or you are, going to get the bathroom remodeled or something like that, which is, it's going to involve lots of steps, and you need to put some stake in the ground so okay, that's an ongoing thing in my life. And finally, you have the someday maybe list. So this is things that you want to keep track of, but you're not working on. And that also helps you clear out the next actions list, so you're not like have 4,000 things and like 3,000 of them are just like totally unrealistic for right now. And so these basic lists, in addition to a calendar, form kind of the backbone of this productivity system. And I mean, I've been using variations of this for the past 2 decades, so this wasn't new for me, but it was still good to kind of like do a full cleaning, go through all my systems. I had created some various sub lists and stuff that weren't working very well anymore. So sort of refactoring everything back to this sort of like default state was very satisfying at the beginning of the month. And then of course, synchronizing the ones that were household stuff with you, I think that solved a lot of the weaknesses that we had with, just like, again, shopping. Like we subdivided the shopping list so that we know that like when we go to Costco, we get certain things. And when we go to like Home Depot, we get certain things. Before it was just on one uncategorized list. And so you'd have to scan the list and be like, okay, this one I can't get here. This one I can't get here. So little things like that have made a big difference, I think, in this month.
Right. And we've started sort of touching base every Sunday on kind of what we want to do this week. And so we're like, okay, did this get done? I know this sounds so boring, but honestly,
boring stuff is important.
It is important because it takes 3 minutes and then you can have fun. Like, I know but you know what I'm saying?
But there's a certain kind of personality that gets like really excited about David Allen's getting things done. Like a lot of people are like yawning, but I mean, having these systems work, I think like, yes, the system itself is boring, but that's kind of what you want. You want it to offload all the boring thinking so that you don't have to do it in your head. And
it's not stressful.
Yeah. And I think, to touch on your point about the weekly touching base, another sort of I wanted to add about the getting things done system. This has been an addition that I've long had to his basic system, is having a separation of things you intend to do today, this week, and then in general, because he just kind of has this, you put it all in a list and then you sort of decide jujitsu, in the moment, which thing you're going to work on. But if you have 100 things, that can be kind of stressful. And so I think for us, for instance, we have a lot of stuff in the house that between kids and work and this kind of stuff, maybe you have an hour when you're tired at the end of the day to do all of it. So being really selective about okay, this is what we're going to try to do this week. This is what we're not going to worry about this week. That's been very helpful too, because then you're setting goals and you're not, feeling guilty all the time because you're not getting all of it done. Because really you can't, but you can get some things done.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's been great. I don't know. I really like it. I really like the system, and it's definitely decreased all the stress of just doing things last minute, or even feeling guilty, I didn't get that done again, right? So how long would you say, if somebody wanted to set this up for themselves, how long did it take you to kind of get all this organized?
Well, I mean, it was probably a lot less time for me because I'm already sort of using a similar system. So what I did is I just went through all my lists, put them on the inbox, deleted all the old lists, and then remade new lists, and then just went through one by one and resorted it. But that's already a pretty organized state, and I'm just sort of refactoring because I had created I'd created different lists for different projects, and some of them were outdated, and I had multiple ideas lists for different things. And it was just, this happens. You get this idea of I should organize it this way, and then it kind of gets cluttered. And so it was not so bad. For someone who has never used this kind of system before, it can take longer. I know in the book, David Allen talks about because he was sort of this executive consultant. So he'd be over at some CEO's house over the weekend, just standing next to them while they're just shoveling garbage into this inbox, going through. And I mean, he also wrote this book, I think it was the early 2000s. It was still mostly paper-based back then too. So these are literally files and old magazines and car tires and stuff that they're dumping into this box. And they would just be how can you just sit there and enjoy this? And he's no, I find it very relaxing, watching you just go through all your stuff. And so it can take I think a full weekend if you feel it's particularly disorganized. Yeah. But I think really getting started doesn't have to be this ordeal. I think just again, getting the inbox started, and then, if you had a lot of, let's say, paper documents, or if you had a lot of outstanding tasks or projects, or you had some other system, I mean, you can, over a period of, let's say, even a whole month, slowly shift the stuff over. So you just kind of view your old system as sort of this queue going into the inbox, and you just have to sort through it all.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wrote down these 3 productivity myths that I kind of got out from your articles.
Okay.
And so I just thought it would be funny to see what your responses are to all of these.
Okay. These are things that I've claimed are productivity myths, or these are
sort
things?
of.
Okay.
Sort of. They were kind of scattered in.
Okay.
I don't even know if.
So am I going to be I'm going to be it's a myth that's a myth, that's actually true? That's going to be, no, I'm just joking. All right, let's see what the 3 are before I say anything. Okay. All right.
Number 1. Stress. Why do I still have an accent?
Stress.
Stress is a vehicle for productivity.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is really commonly believed. I mean, I've believed it in the past too. I believe okay, I work better before deadlines is a common thing that people say. And so I thought it was really interesting that the research actually shows kind of the opposite. Not that stress, having some kind of deadline or pressure is always bad, but that when people are feeling good, when they have this sort of motivated, I'm making progress on meaningful work, that is when they actually perform best. And so I thought it was really interesting that I read one of the books I read this month was The Progress Principle by Teresa Amabile, and I want to say Kramer. And they are Harvard Business School professors, and they did a bunch of research collecting daily diary entries of workers across various teams and fields. And what the two main things they found is, number one, that people, when they had good inner work life, meaning their thoughts and feelings and whatever are positive, they performed better. And second, that the number one thing that caused them to perform better, or to feel better rather, was creating a sense of meaningful progress. So the feeling that like I did something important and I made progress on it every day. And so in their research, what they really found is that like the number one killer of this was, you know, things that created setbacks, often things from the organization. So like the examples they gave are like, you know, nothing kills this motivation more than like I worked all day on something and it's like management then just decide, oh yeah, we're not doing that anymore. Just throw that in the garbage. We're going to work on something else. And so what was really interesting to me is not that like pressure or stress can like never be a vehicle for performance, but rather we have often this idea that like you need to like squeeze people to get them to perform, when really you kind of have to like get out of their way. You have to like get all the things that are preventing them from being naturally productive and remove those obstacles. And so, I mean, this is a truth of management, but I think it's a truth of self-management as well, that the more you can make it so that you can just like get progress and you can check it and you can feel good about it, that's going to make you feel good. And it's also going to make you maximally productive.
Yeah. I'm sure that hits home with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Especially these days. Okay, number 2, high pressure environment bring out the best performance. I guess you kind of touched on that.
Yeah. Myth 1 and myth 2 are the same myth. No, I mean that's true though. I think again, like there is this, you know, work culture, this sort of almost like masochistic work culture where, you know, we're going to make things intense, we're going to be winners, we're going to do this kind of thing, and like, I mean. I forget the researcher who proposed this, but there was this whole like management theory of, you know, this idea that workers are as lazy as possible and you need to use carrots and sticks to get them to actually do their job. And then there's the theory that, well, people are actually intrinsically motivated to do a good job, and so you need to bring that out. And so I think that the latter theory is probably correct for most kinds of work. I mean, perhaps there's some jobs that are just so, you know, intrinsically unpleasant and, you know, they're so unrewarding that like unless you are, you know, chastising people or giving them performance pay, they're not going to do it at all. But I think for most people, like they want to be feeling like they're doing good work. They want to feel like they have a craft, they're contributing something meaningful. And so it's usually the case that there's things in our environment that are making that harder to do. And that's robbing people of that feeling that they can actually make progress. And so, you know, to reiterate both of those 2 points, I think there's a real profound sentiment that's, you know, oh, that's an unfortunate truth about life. Yeah. But I think it's not the case. I think it is the case that, yeah, you perform at your best when you're in an environment that's supportive and not punitive.
Yeah. Myth number 3, I wrote, I'm smart, I don't need a checklist.
Oh, yeah. So this was another one of my favorite books that I read this month, Atul Gawande's The Checklist Manifesto. Now, I'm not actually sure whether I had read this book before. Like, I feel like I maybe had read it before, but it was like so long ago. It's one of those books. But the book is amazing. I mean, Atul Gawande is probably one of the most accomplished people on the planet. He's like this, you know, successful surgeon, best-selling author, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. And in the book, he makes this argument that in the world we live in today, our professional lives in particular are so complicated, they depend on so many years of training and expertise that our failures tend less to be of, well, you know, science doesn't know what the right thing to do is, or there isn't a best practice here, but just that what the best practice is so complicated, or our working environments are so chaotic that we just sometimes make little mistakes. And in a medical context, little mistakes cost people their lives. And so one of the examples he gives up, which I thought was really important, and I'm maybe going to get some of the little details wrong, but there was a study at Johns Hopkins, the hospital, one of the most prestigious institutions in the planet, where they were looking at central line infections. So these are people who have to be put on IV for some reason. And if you get an infection, that can be really bad. It can, you know, cause further complications. You can even die of it. And it's pretty well known what you need to do to avoid getting infections. I mean, you have to make sure you sterilize it. There's all these sort of like persnickety kind of steps you have to do. I'm not a doctor, so the doctors will probably know this better than I do. And the thing that they found actually dropped the central line infections to basically 0 over a 2-year period was forcing everyone to go through a checklist. Like, did you do all of these steps that are necessary to prevent an infection? And indeed empowering the nurses to stop the doctors when they saw them missing a step. And so I think Gawande's point is that we often see ourselves as being too sophisticated for something like a checklist. Like, I don't need a checklist. I don't need to like write down step 1, like sterilize the wound. I know this. I learned this in medical school or what have you. It's obvious. Yeah. But the thing is that it's not that doctors are unintelligent or negligent in any way. In fact, I think in one of the studies they were looking at how many individual actions a doctor or nurse performed on a patient who was in their hospital per day. And it was some huge number, like 170 or something. It was like 170 individual little interactions that could go wrong. And the error rate was less than 1%, which is fantastic. I mean, these are professionals doing their job properly, but it still means that they got 1 or 2 things wrong per day per person. And, especially if it's like you didn't clean something or sterilize something and it creates an infection, like that could cost you your life. And so obviously, not all of us work in such a high stakes field. Definitely when I publish a blog article, if I forget a step, no one's going to die. Although there might be some embarrassing typos. But I think this attitude of viewing checklists and systems indeed like getting things done as this kind of what Gawande calls a cognitive net, this sort of safety thing that catches you when you fall, is often the way to elevate our performance. And so I really enjoyed this book, and I think sometimes, especially people who have a lot of training, a lot of sophistication, they're often the most resistant to this. Like I thought it was very interesting that like the nurses are the ones who are empowered to stop the doctors, because it's the doctors who are like, I'm smart, I'm busy, stop bugging me with this basic stuff. And they're like, but you didn't do this. So. Yeah.
Nice. So then now I want to kind of move over to 3 interesting ideas that I sort of pulled out from your articles and the things that you were writing about. This one is from the Now Habit by Neil Fiore.
Yeah.
And I really like this. It says, booking in advance guilt-free time off to avoid procrastination when important tasks need to be done.
Yeah, Neil Fiore, he has one of the most popular books on overcoming procrastination, The Now Habit, and his sort of model of procrastination is that often the reason we procrastinate is because we sort of associate our work with this kind of anxiety, this sort of state of like, it's like I have to do this. This is so much pressure, and kind of unconsciously we sort of rebel against that by not doing our work, or we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing because we see it as being drudgery. And so he suggests kind of flipping that script. So you put on the calendar, okay, these are these fun things that I'm going to be doing this week that I cannot skip over because I'm too busy. And by doing that, you sort of set yourself up of like, well, first of all, it reduces the amount of time you have to work. So you have to be extra productive. But then it also sort of flips the script. So that there's sort of that light at the end of the tunnel. And the funny thing is that this is something that, I had just recently read Fiore's book, so it's not like I learned it from him, but this is sort of a strategy that I've used for years, because I think sometimes when you're in a high pressure, high stress state, the default reaction is like, okay, I will deal with that stress by just working longer hours, working more. And indeed, sometimes you have to. I don't want to say that, you can just always avoid working a lot. But if you try to do that over a really long period of time, your efficiency drops so much that it ends up being negative. Like you end up getting less done than if you had worked fewer hours. And so the example I often think of, because I deal with a lot of students in my work, is students who have like an exam coming up. They're super stressed about it. They're not sure whether they're going to pass. And so they spend like huge amounts of hours in the library studying, but the quality of the studying time is so low that, they would be much better off if they said, okay, I'm going to study for 6 hours today. And then after, like, I'm going to go bowling with my friends, or I'm going to go out for dinner, or I'm going to like take a nap, or what have you. And so I don't know, I noticed this a lot with students when I was in university. I'm sure it's true in a lot of office environments and places where people are very stressed. stressed out. And so the solution I have is, schedule your time off. Like when I was doing the MIT challenge, it was a lot of work, but I made sure that like after 6, 7 p.m., I wasn't working in the evening, which I mean, given that I was putting in sometimes like 10 hours a day on studying, to have every evening off, which is somewhat unusual for students who I think are often studying a lot less than that. So I think that's something that Fiore recommends that I found personally effective for overcoming procrastination and getting to work.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. What about this one? This is something that you've wrote from The Effective Executive. Peter, you were talking, and I've heard this term all the time now, especially in like podcasts and social media, the knowledge worker, and then how pretty much every idea of working effectively in modern society is traced back to his thinking. Drucker, and so what did I say here? Oh, yes. So I wrote how effective executives don't start with their tasks, but their time. And they don't start with planning, but where their time goes. I thought that was a very interesting idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, he has this really slim book called The Effective Executive. It's a classic. I mean, and he's writing in a time period. Obviously, he is thinking in some sense about the leader of industry, the university chair, this kind of person. But really, he's talking about knowledge workers. He's the one who coined this term knowledge worker because he was living through this transition from the kind of industrial model where people just mostly did manual labor to this idea where workers themselves had to decide what they were going to do and when they were going to do it. They had that autonomy. They had to make those decisions. And so in his view, all of those people are executives. They have to make those executive decisions. And so his argument was that, you look at people and say, okay, I'm going to set out all these goals. Like, this is what's important for my day. I'm going to work on this. I'm going to work on that. And you look at, you'd actually do, he's working obviously from like the 1950s where a lot of these executives, like they have like a secretary or something. And they ask the secretary to just like actually record what time was spent on various activities. And the funny thing is that like it doesn't at all match up with the goals that these people had. And his argument was that, well, that's because the executive, most of their time is not theirs. Most of their time is not something that they're just like, okay, I'm going to sit down and have 8 hours of deep work. It's constant interruptions. It's someone saying you have to do this. Oh, you have to go do that. And so his argument was that like if you start with this sort of goal-oriented approach, which is admittedly, that's kind of like the David Allen getting things done approach. It's like you start with your task. He's like, well, if you start with your time, figure out where your time is actually going every day, then you have the possibility of making changes. And I think one of the examples he gives in the book was some CEO or some high-level person who like almost every night of the week had some kind of function that he had to attend. And it was like a huge drain on their sort of productivity and effectiveness. And they felt like they had to because it was, retirement for, some longstanding employee or some major client or this kind of thing. And I think the outcome was that he delegated that. So like someone else from the company would attend. And he actually found, I think the example that he used was that like a lot of these people were just inviting him because they felt like they had to, because he was the boss. And once he showed up to these events, they were like, oh, what are you doing here? Like you don't personally know Joe Schmo who's retiring for 35 years. Like you didn't actually have to be here for this. We just felt like we had to invite you because you're the big boss and this kind of thing. And so, I mean, not everyone has to go to a function every single night to do this kind of work, but sometimes we often get in this trap of thinking, oh, I have to do X, I have to attend that meeting, I have to, do these sorts of like pretty low value activities for social obligation reasons. And I mean, sometimes you do have to do them, but sometimes you don't. And so a lot of productivity is seeing what actually eats up most of your time at work and then figuring out, okay, which of these things can I get rid of or negotiate with my boss or my colleagues and be like, you know what, I'm kind of peripheral. Maybe I don't attend this meeting. Could you just send me the minutes? And, maybe they'll be like, okay, great. They were inviting you because they didn't want to leave you out, but you don't actually need to attend, right?
Yeah, I like that. Nice. Another thing I wanted to go over, which I think would be very useful for people, the 4 disciplines of execution. So single focus, track your progress, put up a scoreboard, and then stay accountable. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, this is another good book. This was the first time I read it. So this is has a number of authors, so I won't list all of them, but The 4 Disciplines of Execution is a really good book on how do you achieve goals. Now, it's sort of written, again, for this kind of business organizational context. That is like one of the problems of this genre, is that it has a very like managerial flavor. Mm-hmm. So like they're talking about, how do you manage your team to achieve sort of company objectives? But I think it has a lot of lessons for personal productivity and personal effectiveness, even if you are not a manager itself. So the 4 disciplines, one is to focus. So you need to set a single goal, and they articulated better than I ever had this idea. So I've often sort of talked about this idea of single projecting, of like having one project. And then I get into these endless debates about people of like what counts as a project and what makes it one. And like, well, I also have to do this. And are you saying just do one thing at a time? And I had a hard time kind of articulating what I mean by that, but they did a really good job where they separate. Essentially, you have what they call a WIG, or a wildly important goal. Business people love acronyms. They love these silly acronyms. When I was listening to the audiobook and they're talking about WIGs the whole time, it was driving me crazy. But they, you have your wildly important goal, which is something that's sort of out of the ordinary. This is something that would not happen if you did not apply like a sustained kind of breakthrough effort on it. And then what they call your whirlwind, which is sort of like all the other stuff that you kind of have to do, that you would do, that is sort of like just managing your life. Mm-hmm. And they were making the argument that the number one thing that keeps people from achieving their goals is the whirlwind. It's just all the stuff that's happening in life. And I mean, this is something we can probably reflect on, but like you've got 2 kids at home, you've got appointments, you've got lots of things. So that's 90% of your capacity. It's not the case that like 100% of my efforts going towards my goals. No, of course not. Like 95% of your capacity, 90%, depending on where you are, is just going to just like keep all the balls you're juggling up in the air. And so they recommend, if you're going to have a goal to focus on, just have this one and keep that separate. Like you still have to do all of the things to sustain your business or to sustain your life, but just keep that focus. So that's the first one. The second one is to set up lag and lead metrics. So you need to actually measure progress towards the goal. And this is often nuanced because a lot of things you want to improve are often qualitative. They're often a little vague. It's often like not clear what you want to do. So getting really clear metrics for like what counts as winning in this goal is very important. And I really liked their discussion of lead metrics, which is that, everyone often has the lag metric. So if you're in a business, it's like how many sales you make, or, if I'm writing blog articles, or I'm making this, on YouTube, it's going to be how many views it gets. And these are things that you can see, but they're after the fact, and they're things that you can't directly control. Whereas lead metrics are the things that not only influence the lag metrics, but they are things that are completely under your control. So the analogy they give is like if you were trying to lose weight, the lag metric is standing on the scale. The lead metric is measuring your calorie intake and expenditure. And I like that example because they point out a big thing about lead metrics is that you're probably not collecting them, and they're annoying to collect, and you do need to collect them. And so this sort of like most businesses, they're focused on the lag metrics because they're kind of obvious and they're pretty easy to measure, but designing good lead metrics and actually tracking them often involves creating new work. But it's very important because if you're not tracking them, it's very hard to achieve the goal. And then third and fourth one I'll do real quickly. One is making a scoreboard so that everyone can see what the progress is over time toward the goal. And then the fourth is to have weekly accountability meetings. I think this is more of a team thing, but basically the idea of the meeting is like each time you meet, everyone makes commitments of like what they're going to personally do to move the goal forward, despite all their other, objectives that they have to do to just keep their lives running. And then you sort of hold them accountable to that. So it's sort of like, okay, you said last week you're going to do this. Did you do it? And so I think, obviously you can understand how this would work in an organization, but I think as a personal framework for achieving things, it's not a bad book to read. Yeah.
Nice. We have weekly meetings now.
Yes. Getting very corporate in our family here.
I kind of asked you most things I wanted to ask you, but I kind of wanted to end here with a quote from you.
From me. Okay.
Yes. You wrote this in one of your articles about this topic. And I thought it was quite deep and profound and interesting, and I didn't really know how to think about it.
Okay.
So I wanted your thoughts. So this is what it says. It says, maybe it's just age, but I'm increasingly convinced that doing what's right and doing what's effective cannot be separated, and that strategies to maximize our desires without asking whether those desires ought to be maximized in the first place are ultimately self-defeating.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this one was really from rereading Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And this was a book that I read when I was a teenager, and it did have an influence on me then, but I think I appreciate it so much differently now, not only because, Stephen Covey, he was, a family man, he had a business, he had like 9 kids, which is crazy. And I feel like now that I'm a parent and I'm a little bit, I'm not in Stephen Covey's position, but I'm like closer to that sort of like life orientation. I read the book differently than I did when I was, a childless teenager reading that book. And he spends a lot of time emphasizing this idea of putting character before kind of strategies. So there's a lot of books you can read out there that are about sort of ways that you can get what you want, that are essentially don't stress a lot the kind of like, well, should you even be pursuing that goal in the first place? Like, they're not trying to tell you, they're just sort of like, this is how you achieve your business goals. This is how you achieve your productivity goals. This is how you, earn more money, or, find a good relationship or make friends. And it's very, what he calls this sort of personality ethic, is this idea of like achieving success sort of directly. Whereas he was really focused on this idea that, well, you have to start from this foundation of like, well, is this the right way to do things? Is this like treating people the right way? Is this the kind of goal that you should achieve? And I feel like, I think we have a little bit of almost an allergy to like overly moralizing self-help. Like, there's a, maybe that's sort of the aftertaste of like, maybe you had some kind of religious upbringing that, maybe you got a little disillusioned with, or maybe it was, just culturally we sort of don't like being overly opinionated about like how other people should be living and what they should be doing. And I certainly am in that camp. Like, definitely all the books and articles I write, I tend to be, I think, fairly pluralistic and value neutral when I'm talking about it. But I think the way I've been shifting my thinking a lot is that, if you ground all your decisions in like what's expedient, what's effective, and you don't really think of that question of like what's right, what should I be doing, what goals should I be pursuing, is this even a desire that I have, is this like the right desire to have, you can't possibly achieve success in life in the deep sense. Like, you can't possibly live a fulfilling life if the aims that you set out to fulfill were just the wrong aims to have in the first place. So I don't think there's like an answer for finding what those aims should be. But I feel like as I've gotten older, I've become kind of increasingly convinced that there's sort of no way around that. And I think, no discussion of productivity, I think, could be complete without discussing sort of, well, what are you actually trying to be productive for? And what are the sort of goals you have with your work? Particularly with, how does your work actually impact people? Are you doing work that's genuinely valuable to human beings and to your employees and to your colleagues? And then at a secondary level, how are you treating other people? How are you treating the people you work with? How are you treating the people at home? Is it in an expedient way where you're just trying to like, how do I get what I want from this interaction? Yeah. Or is it in a, principle centered way where you're asking like, well, is this the right thing to do? And I think, if you, I agree with Covey in this sense that, there's always going to be shortcuts you can take in life. But at the end of the day, in the long term, I do think that if you approach life in that more principle-centered way, you're going to make more progress. So I feel like, rereading that book, that had a bigger impact on me, I think, this time around.
I like that. I think that's such a good answer. I don't know. I think we can close it. I'm kind of.
I'm getting all misty-eyed right here.
I know.
I didn't mean it to be like that. But so before we go, let's talk a little bit about what's happening next month. So in the next month, we're going to be shifting to the third foundation, or money, or personal finance, and this is going to be a really interesting one for me because, again, I feel like money, personal finance can be this incredibly foreboding technical sort of topic. I mean, I studied finance in school, but there's exponential formulas and calculations and really complicated theories. But at the same time, there's this core behavioral element of like, spend less than you earn, save the rest, continue to invest even when the market goes down, and like, don't withdraw all your money. All of these sort of emotional, psychological things that really make it if anything, more behavioral than intellectual. And so I'm really interested to sort of dive into a lot of the books, the research, kind of go back to stuff I've already read and hopefully go deeper in some of the things that I haven't. And then talk about, sort of how we're also making some adjustments to how we think about our own financial planning, especially, now revisiting it. I have a family, I have dependents, I have things that I care about. And I think that's going to be an interesting discussion to have next month.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you'll join us for next month. Take care.